For first home buyers, it's welcome news when property prices start falling. But what looks like a great opportunity might conceal a long-term problem. In this episode, we discuss the warning signs.
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to get it right.
I'm Megan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mums. But that's a good thing because between us, we've got over 40 years experience and we are going to share with you bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure that you get unbiased and real information that you can rely on so you can get where you want to be without missing a step.
Now, we've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au. There you'll find free checklists that you can download, a free mini course on how to price a property, and our Where to Buy workshop for only $39. Priceless stuff, really.
Bargain. But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, here's the boring bit, the disclaimer. You, of course, know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field of expertise. Now, we've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording, but things change. So check with the relevant government authority or your advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today, we're talking about whether it's really a good idea to chase opportunities in a buyer's market. It's tempting to look for suburbs where prices have fallen the most, but is this the wisest course of action? But before we get into that, what is your special house this week, Megan?
Do you remember a few episodes ago, I showed you the basket building?
Yes.
Well, I've gone down a little bit of a tangent. So it's not a house. But this one is the fisheries department in India. So for those of you who aren't watching, who are just listening, honestly, do yourself a favour and jump on YouTube and have a look because this is a fascinating building. It looks like a fish and you enter under one of the fins. So it's not really a building that could be easily repurposed though.
No, let's, the fish markets perhaps, but you know what's so weird is it's pretty ugly. It looks like some weird dolphin.
Imagine being briefed as an architect. We are the fisheries department of India and we would like a fish.
It would have been a lot nicer, sort of a building with scales on the outside of it or something. But
I'm sure I can find one. You've set me with the task.
There you go. Find a building with scales on it. And I do think you have far too much time on your hand, Megan. You can dig these things up. But
no, I just find it fun. On a Monday night at 8 o'clock when the kids are in bed.
What are we going to put on the podcast this week, says Megan. All right. So let's get stuck into this episode all about whether you should be bargain hunting or not.
Yeah, and the inspiration for this one came from a Domain article titled, "These are the opportunities. The suburbs where property prices are cheaper now than they were 5 years ago." Alarm bells start ringing already, but let's explore a little bit further.
I know. It's like, at first it sounds compelling. Oh my God, great. I can buy it at 2017 prices. Yay, I'm going to feel like a real hero. And you go, hang on a minute. If they can go backwards so dramatically, particularly when you had price rises in 2021 as steep as they were, what could possibly be wrong?
What could possibly be right? And there's a lot of reasons why prices did escalate at such a rapid pace in that 21-22 period. But of course, it is starting to settle down, taper down, and some prices are going backwards in some areas. But importantly, and we always talk about this, Veronica, and I can't stress it enough, there is no Australian property market. So we can't talk about the market going up or the market going down. Probably the only time we could do that, and I don't know that it's ever happened any time since records were kept previously, but it was the post-COVID period where almost every market went in a similar direction. but across the country. But
so everything went down in May 2020, and then everything started going up again from about October 2020.
October, November, just went nuts. But now we're going to see markets start to need to be separated again and looked at in isolation and their own sets of criteria, because wrapping up, even at the moment, we're seeing the media talk about the Australian property market prices going down. But really, when they break that down, even by capital city, it is Sydney and Melbourne, and it's not significant. It's not huge decreases. And then the other capital cities are sitting at probably reasonably level, maybe slightly increased. I even saw one breakdown the other day into the dollar value based on the median of the increases and decreases. Sydney was, I think it was about 80,000 or something. Brisbane was about $1,000 rise in median house price over that month. Not overly helpful, really.
No.
So we really need to start focusing on really driving down into that suburb and property type level when we're talking about price increase and decrease.
Well, that's the thing too, because let's face it, over the past, like you say, we've had this unique situation over 2021 where it looked like the entire country was rising, some rising more than others and probably overshot the mark. I mean, you've got in this article, it talks about Sunshine Beach at Noosa and the alpine town of Jindabyne, New South Wales, just at sort of the bottom of the, Thredbo and Perisher and those places, had seen prices rise by nearly 200% in this 5-year period we're talking about. So that's fabulous, to double in that time. And others like Tenerife in Brizzy, you'll know that, Anglesey and Geelong and Palm Beach and Sydney's northern beaches, more than doubled, right? But the thing is, I know, like I'll talk to Palm Beach, for instance, that had underperformed for years. So there was probably a lag effect. It was catching up and then the acceleration. So all of these, understanding what's really going on in these marketplaces does make a big difference.
For sure.
And also,
Tenerife's a really interesting one because it's such a small suburb. It is the smallest suburb in Brisbane. There are very few houses there. So it's a great stat and it tells a fabulous media-based story, but it's not very helpful.
No, because if you've got a really small suburb, there's only a small amount of sales.
Only a couple of
transactions. And it doesn't take much to skew the data. So there's always...
Don't aspire to live in Tenerife unless you have many millions of dollars.
Yeah. There's always... They've got lovely views, don't they, of Brisbane really City nice. And the river and stuff. And they're high, so they're not going to get flooded. So I shouldn't laugh.
Look down upon those who are with wet feet. Yes.
Now, there are always exceptions, of course, even in a property boom. And I guess the question is, do you really want to buy into the exception? Because losing money while everybody else is making money is actually insane.
Yeah. And history is a fairly good predictor of the future. So I think it's important that we look at it. But again, we need to dig under the surface of these statistics and say, well, why are these areas losing money? Why have they gone backwards in 5 years when everything else has gone forwards? And has it been rapid or has it been over time? Or, how has this actually been? Has there been something happen in that particular suburb that has caused a rapid decline in prices? Something that we can put our fingers on in Brisbane quite easily is flood. So when there has been a period of non-flood, activity that hasn't affected properties, people start to forget. But prices will rapidly drop in a suburb, even if it probably wasn't flood affected. Sometimes because the suburb gets tarred with the same brush. Is that the saying?
Yes.
I don't know. But again, even if there is many properties in that suburb that didn't, so there are factors that can actually influence, and I think delving into that is more important than just looking at the stats.
And you can also look at history. Like you said, history is a good predictor of the future. I mean, Perth has underperformed compared to the rest of the country for a decade, and Darwin has been the absolute terrible performer. And so, you say, well, they've got history of not performing very well over time. So what would have suddenly happened to have changed that pattern? What was causing the history? Has that changed? And you could argue that in certain mining towns, for instance, no, definitely Darwin, no. And they've had some price growth, for instance, in areas over 2021, purely because the whole country seemed to be going up. So, but it's relative as well. I mean, their price growth was at a much smaller amount than other places. And, funnily enough, only South Australia and Tasmania have not had a single suburb fall in value over the past 5 years. And I wonder why that is.
Yeah. It still sits in the affordable range, doesn't it? So both of those suburbs have come from very, very, very low cost base. Areas have come from very low cost base. And it might be argued that it was their opportunity to attract the lower end investors and first home buyers. Yeah. And that's probably why we've seen that push in demand to those sorts of areas, because of their price points.
And the problem, of course, with that is if the prices are going up because of investor activity, particularly if those investors are coming from elsewhere, that's a warning sign. That's a danger sign. But one thing too, I think, particularly South Australia and Tassie, I'm just coming up with an idea here rather than actually having hard data to back this up, but potentially less unit development, because a lot of oversupplied areas, that unit data drags down all of the data. So once again, you've got to get in there, get granular and get to understand what sort of properties are going up versus what sort of properties are going down in value. Because when we dig further into this article, a lot is units.
Yeah,
in fact, the vast majority
of what's reported in the article is it's there's no doubt about it. And is it because of interstate investors, as you mentioned, or the unit developments? The other thing about unit development, so when you bring, one of the things that we talk about in the course is scarcity. So when you've got an area that can't have a great deal of higher density development, then you can't increase the supply of the property. You can't make more land. If you can't go up, you've got to go out. So if there is a lot more units that come in and that becomes an attractive proposition because of the price points to people who might be investors, first home buyers, then that can take the demand away from the houses in those areas, because a lot of people don't want to live in an area that's got a huge amount of high-rise units. If they're on a house on freehold land, they prefer to go to a lower density area. So bringing those kinds of developments in can actually affect the demand for the houses in those areas and put downward pressure on them. Also, if you've got a few houses scattered in amongst high unit development, it's not a particularly pleasant living environment. So people might look at it and go, wow, I can buy a really cheap house, but it's in amongst 4 or 5 blocks of units and you don't get any sunshine. There's no, ventilation's terrible. You're just completely blocked at all angles by these blocks of units. And often parking in the street is really hard when you've got lots and lots of people trying to all converge post-work day or head out of their complexes. So these can get very, very busy. And if you're a person who wants to live in a freehold home, that can become quite unattractive.
It's funny, isn't it? I mean, people go, oh, but houses are always better than units.
Depends. And there's the exception to the rule.
Depends. Yeah. In Canberra, homes in just 2 suburbs cost less than they did 5 years ago. And in both of those areas, it was only units, not houses. So this is, once again, it's like, oh, great, Canberra, where would I go? Oh, I've got to buy a unit in Bruce or the CBD. And Canberra has had its fair share of overdevelopment as well. But I guess too, one of the things that would actually inflate prices in any particular year is when new developments are first completed. And so, and I've seen this, that, and once again, this skews the data. It makes one year look really expensive sometimes because one unit development was completed and sold, and buyers tend to pay a premium for brand new units. So it makes it look like the median price is going up, but all they've done is just change the stock.
Yeah. Yep. So you've got to look in those areas, you've got to look at resale of established stock rather than looking at sales of new stock. And that takes a bit of work. It takes a little bit of work to delve into that information to see what is actually impacting prices. Are they going up? Are they going down? It's the resale of established stocks without improvement between the 2 sale dates that will give you a bit more of an accurate picture. And we talk about that quite a lot in the course and when doing the evaluation component. But I think the thing that's just come into my head as we talk through this, as often when we talk, things just roll on that weren't actually part of the original process. But we're talking about, this article talks about suburbs where properties are cheaper now than they were 5 years ago. Does that necessarily mean that they're cheap or just cheaper?
Good point.
So we're not necessarily saying that these are or the article perhaps isn't necessarily pointing out or differentiating between the median prices in these areas or what you can buy, what your money would buy. It's just simply saying that at some point the prices in those areas were higher than what they are now. And I think the investigation into why that is, the behind the scenes stuff, is far more important than the headline itself.
Do you know, if we go back to 10 years, you know, this is the thing. Like in Darwin, for instance, the Northern Territory, because they've got like 2 suburbs where prices are lower than they were in 2017. So the cost of a unit in Darwin City is 19.9% lower now than it was 5 years ago. And the median price is like 432,500, right? And the cost of a house in Humpty Doo.
I love
Could
that.
you ever live in a place called Humpty Doo? Which is a commuter town, 40 minutes drive. Why would you commute in Darwin? It's not exactly got a huge population. The houses are 3.8% cheaper than they were 5 years ago. But if you go back 10 years in Darwin, you know, like it's quite shocking actually that people have invested. And if you live there and you live in your home, it's a different proposition. But so many people invested money in Darwin, and the pain and gain report that CoreLogic put out every quarter. Darwin is the star performer, if you call it a star, or they get the gong every single quarter without fail for the highest amount of loss-making properties. So it's terribly,
it's not an
terribly
award
tragic.
You want, is it?
Yeah. And I guess we don't have many listeners wanting to buy a home in Darwin, but if you are, you know, that you've really got to sort of think a lot about that, because, you know, that is probably we did an episode a few weeks back about when it's better to actually rent rather than buy. Yeah. And maybe it's better to rent if you're living in Darwin and buy elsewhere as a rent-vester.
Yes. Yeah, have a really good think about that. Now, in New South Wales, there are a number of suburbs where homes are selling for less than 2017 prices. And interestingly, they're all in Sydney and they're all units.
Yep.
17 suburbs.
Yeah, and nearly all of them have had massive new developments.
The theme happening here, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, there's a theme. Agents have been quoted as saying that ongoing supply, even in neighbouring suburbs, has put a dent in prices. And I've seen that, actually. And if this continues, there'll be potentially no capital growth to be expected in the next 5 years. So, you know, don't be rushing off to buy an apartment in Botany or Ryde or North Ryde, I should say, those sort of places. And the answer really is uniqueness and a finite supply. And funnily enough, Newtown, which is actually where I live, is on the list. It's number 17. But there have been massive prices paid for units, though, in this same suburb. So whilst it's on the list as prices, the median price of units apparently is less than it was 5 years ago. I find that interesting because this is where data can be very misleading because honestly, particularly last year, some of the prices paid for units in this area with scarcity factor were absolutely eye-watering.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Is that granularity that we always harp on about. So whilst that statistic looks bad for the suburb and property type of units, as you say, if you dig into that scarcity factor, which might be views that can't be built out, it might be size of the unit itself, you know, certainly 3-4 bedroom is, they're in high demand for downsizes. Facilities within the complex, body corporate levies, all those sorts of things can come into play when we're talking about the uniqueness of a unit. And yes, they can, you know, Art Deco style, the older styles that may have been in really unique buildings that aren't going to be replicated because there's no money to be made in those for developers.
Or a converted warehouse.
Yeah, you know? All those things that they're not going to be remade. They can't be mass reproduced. But a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom or a 1-bed, 1-bath are easy to reproduce.
Very. And they prove it by continuing to reproduce them.
En masse. Now, Melbourne suburbs, things like places like Doncaster, Toorak, South Bank and Armidale have suffered the bulk of their price falls over the last couple of years as the COVID property trend that favoured houses, particularly on the outer suburbs and regions, left inner city units lagging behind. Now, of course, we saw the greatest net migration decrease in net migration in Melbourne from Victoria as people left what was a really difficult time. But other suburbs that have recorded negative results for units over the 5-year period, such as Carlton, Melbourne City and South Yarra, are actually back on the rise. They're starting to recover a little bit from their wobbly boot period. But again, does that mean that it's a good time to buy? You'd have to have a look at all of the factors that sit around that. Why did it have an increase? Why is it having an increase? And are there factors coming in, like another lot of new developments that may actually push the prices back down again?
And that's the thing. I mean, there's still a lot of opportunity to develop in lots of places. So it's really important to, like, aerial maps are a great starting point there. Just see if there, what sort of sites are still available. But also in some of these
have development maps. So you can actually go, there are sites that actually place visually developments that have been submitted but not approved, have been submitted and approved, have been submitted, approved, and construction has started. So you can see at different phases of that development what might be going into different areas. Fabulous, really great free source of information online.
Well, we should chuck the link in the show notes, shouldn't we?
We'll do that.
You will do that. And I think too, the other thing with urban renewal is that sometimes you don't necessarily know. You can't sort of see on a map. Like you can certainly see what's been approved, what Megan was just talking about there. But whereas with subdivisions and the edges of towns and cities or whatever, you can actually see on a map all these sites, all these just land that could be repurposed. Whereas in urban renewal areas, sometimes they're massive industrial sites. So you need to familiarise yourself with what councils planning, and also the state governments in many cases have got urban renewal programs, and those things can last a decade to get developed. And in that whole time, there can be a real constraint on growth. And in fact, because in Melbourne, like 16 suburbs in Melbourne really fall into this category, and topping the list with a shocking 44% reduction of prices since 2017 is East Melbourne. Now, if that data doesn't scare you off a brand new apartment, I'm not sure what will, but you've also got to ask, is the data reliable? Because you talk about composition bias, and that is really where you've got to dig into it to work out, well, what is likely to fall in value or not grow in value versus what is likely to grow in value, because the crap falls more than the good stuff, and it actually skews the data. So local knowledge is so important.
Yeah, and just digging down into the property type within that data. And that's hard to do, but you can do it by looking at sold properties during the period that's actually being reported on. You can have a 1-bedroom apartment sells for $115,000. You can have a fabulous 3-bedroom apartment with views that might be $1.5-2 million. One might have gone down, one might have gone up on resale. So it's really important to dig underneath it and make sure you're looking at the right stats.
Yeah, because when you are looking in an area where there's a diversity of stock, the stats don't tell the story at all.
Now, Queensland units tell the same story as New South Wales and Victoria, and that we had a huge amount of supply come on, and units are not things that Queenslanders want to live in. They want to have their feet on the ground. They want the sunshine. They want the outdoors. But leafy inner city favourites like Windsor, which is a really well-regarded suburb, Indooroopilly, also well-regarded with good public and private schools, Balimba, one of the highest household income suburbs in Queensland, and Wooloowin, which is just beautiful and leafy, they're all more affordable than they were in 2017, thanks to an oversupply of units. So we're talking units, not houses. But we're starting to absorb that supply because a lot of developments were actually shelved when prices were experiencing some downward trends. The latest domain data found that Brisbane unit prices rose by the biggest price growth that we've seen in units in Brisbane, by 9.3% over the 12 months to March, to a record median of 437,000 odd. So I think that absorbing of the existing oversupply, the net migration that has come in from interstate and expats moving back from overseas during the COVID period has actually soaked up a lot of that supply. I think it's really, really important that people don't see that as an ongoing trend without taking into account more stock that might come on, because we will see the same sort of problem if we see that oversupply again and we start to see net migration settle down to its normal levels and start to see some exodus of people going back overseas and back into state for employment opportunities. So really, really, massive word of caution there about units in Brisbane, because we had such a strong influx of people and nobody leaving. It's going to change. So be really, 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 really cautious about thinking that that's good, strong growth statistics for Brisbane over the long term.
Such a good example of how you could inadvertently make a huge mistake purely because you're looking at data. And, you know, this might have your head spinning, but we do teach you how to do this in the course. Because this is really
eyes wide open.
Yeah, it's really important that, you know, you're going to make this huge decision buying your first property. You just, like Megan said, eyes wide open, take responsibility and learn this stuff, because it's easy to make a huge mistake. We've just given you all these examples of people who have lost money. If prices are falling in these areas in certain types of properties, then people have bought them and lost money. And they may not be actually selling them and they think that they haven't lost money, but you only really lose it when you actually realize that loss. But, you know, if you had to sell it and you're going to get less than you paid, then you have made a loss. And we don't want that for you, because it is avoidable.
In this episode, we've covered a very small part of our 10-step online course for first-time buyers. If you would like to learn more about the process and how to buy without making a mistake, then head over to our website, www.homebuyeracademy.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you like what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. 5 stars would be wonderful. It will help others find us as well.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with some more priceless stuff.